AI is becoming an integral part of any business's IT infrastructure, inserted into the platforms and tools we use every day, as an interactive chat partner, as hard-coded AI processing, in other ways programmatic workflows, as an agentic partner for coding, right through to autonomous workflow execution. Well, almost. It can get pretty overwhelming. Here's everything we currently use and what we use it for. First, infrastructure. Where is the computing power? We've got a couple of places where we run our workloads. We'll start with the one that's sat in that corner. It's not even a particularly modern Raspberry Pi. It's only a Raspberry Pi 4. Most of our always-on and persistent code actually runs on that. It's free. I considered it non-production, but the thing just doesn't break. So it's a great place to run code where you need an always-on server without having to pay for remote hosting. We have Google Cloud Functions that's always on, but mostly in response to stuff that happens in the world, like webhooks or database events, that kind of thing. That's where we used to run our app, the Bean Counter. If it's production ready and hardened, I might consider doing it there rather than on the Raspberry Pi. Also, there's of course this local PC that I'm recording all of this on. This is where we would run any on-demand code. Realistically, if it needs some powerful computing unit, and I'm sat at the desk while I'm doing it, it might as well be my own PC. So lots of code runs right here on this. And of course, there's options for remote hosting. It's not actually that expensive. You have options like hosting a run pod. And we also noticed one recently called Vast.ai. That was quite useful for us to have a look and see how we might be able to run certain workloads on specific consumer hardware options. There are some GPUs, consumer GPUs that you can pick to test to see if something you're planning to run locally would work on that piece of hardware. So that's quite useful. But we haven't had to use it yet. We're pretty much satisfied with Raspberry Pi, Google Cloud Functions, and this PC. It's not an awful lot. And we bring it all together with Cloudflare, pretty much because that allows us to access some of these things remotely. So I have some Docker images that are running on the Raspberry Pi. I have some running on this computer, and they are connected to the internet through a domain name, and Cloudflare exposes that. So I can access it from somewhere else. If I didn't want it to be accessible from anywhere publicly, I might use Tailscale instead, and then my device out and about would simply join the local network and be able to see these devices wherever we were. But I couldn't find that working on every piece of hardware that I own. There's no client for my watch, for example. So any app that I make on here and want to interact with some of my stuff, which I've been trying, I can't use Tailscale for that. So we tend to use Cloudflare for that and allow the Cloudflare D the tunnel so that we can host those things remotely. So this is the hardware. This is where we run our compute, because loads of AI doesn't run on your own compute. It runs within the app servers that provide you with the services. It runs on Microsoft systems, on Google systems, on OpenAI systems, on Anthropic systems, and so on. So I'm going to just access them remotely. But this is the compute that I control, and this is what we could consider to be private. Likewise, if you were running a VPS, virtual private server. So lots of people do that for AI workflows, but so far, local has worked well for us, and we're sticking with it, at least for now. So what do we used to use? So the first places are the really obvious ones. It's the chat interfaces. It's the ones you already know. It's ChatGPT, it's Claude, it's Gemini, which we used to use AI Studio to talk to. We still use them from time to time, but realistically, I pay for AI elsewhere in a different interface and use a different interface. I don't use these free ones anymore, and it was free that we used to use it. But the trade-off of that is that they will train on your data, at least usually they will, and maybe some way of getting rid of it, but it's usually only if you pay. I don't want to put any client information in something where I'm not sure if it's going to be going into training data, so I haven't used these. And when I have chosen to pay for a service, it just happens to not be one of these ones, it happens to be somewhere else. So these ones I don't use anymore. Then, of course, there's plugins for software that you already use, which I still use from time to time if I only need the AI then and there and what I'm working on in the moment. I don't want to leave the interface. I don't want to break my flow. We're talking using Copilot in Microsoft software, using Gemini in Google software. I don't actually have G Suite, so that's never been my place, but that's there too. Maybe the AI in Notion if you're using the paid version. Sometimes there's an upgrade involved to get AI in platform, but if that's how you use AI, then maybe that's a good trade. There's Jax in Zero. It brings me on to the problem. Often these are limited by what's called, I think it's referred to as innovator's dilemma. It basically means that they have a brand to lose, and so they can't innovate so far that they risk anything going wrong with their brand. They can't afford to trash your Word documents beyond repair. They can't afford to make mistakes in your business infrastructure, which means that they take fewer risks. And maybe it's time to take some risks and have AI doing an awful lot more, which is why that innovation is often left to third parties without the brand power. And so those are not the places where I tend to use AI the most. There are also third-party plugins for some of the software that we use. For example, in Google Sheets, I used to have an extension that I used called GPT for Sheets, and that was enabling you to have like a GPT function. So you could write in the as a formula GPT and then some code that would be able to refer to other bits of the spreadsheet and basically just sort of make a template prompt. So if you had like a basic lead sheet, you could say, give me an opening sentence for this person working in this company in this industry, stuff like that. But I don't tend to do that so much anymore. I think there are better ways of using AI to gradually build things than doing it as formally in the workbooks. But still, those tools are there. Just don't happen to use them anymore. Another thing that I used to use was Copilot in Obsidian. So this is an assistant that would sit there and you can reference your notes and pass them to AI. The useful thing with this and with some of the others in this sort of category is that they can use third-party AI that isn't necessarily OpenAI, Anthropic, Gemini, any of that. It can be local, which is great because that means that you do absolutely get a little bit of extra privacy. But I don't tend to work in my platform using AI that much anymore. I tend to prefer to work sort of natural language first. I would much rather have an AI interface and then have that reference my stuff in Obsidian rather than be working in Obsidian and then quickly ask AI to process the current file I'm working on somehow. But still, it's there. I've got a lot of these things enabled and occasionally they're the right solution. Another thing that I've got here is Page Assist. That's a plugin for the browser. I originally had it when I was using Chrome. I've kept it here even when I've moved to Comet because you can open this side panel and then it'll have this side panel and you'll notice it's actually using Llama. So this is entirely private. And I can chat with the contents of the page with a local AI model, which is pretty useful. However, most of the time I'm perfectly happy using in Comet built-in assistant, which can also command the browser to do stuff. Maybe not client identifying details, those kinds of things which I don't like to push through to third-party AIs. I like to keep that private, but most everything else I'm happy to go through Perplexity. So I tend to use that instead. A lot of promise out of Letter. Letter, I did do some useful work in. It was Letter may be better known as MemGPT. That was the paper that was published that talked about maintaining memory for these light agentic systems. It was quite useful, but memory is now table stakes stuff, and there are some interesting new solutions that I'm interested in trying. So Letter's fading away. I'm going to be trying some other stuff now. Agent Zero looked like it was going to be a real favorite that would be using heavily. This is a background kind of agent with its own computing platform, and you would simply give it a task, go away, and it would use all the tools available to it within its own little private operating system to solve that problem and to achieve that outcome. It was really good looking stuff. At the time that it came out, it needed to be one of the flagship models. which can end up quite expensive. And I did find it quite hard to change models at the time. The versions I was using, whenever I wanted to change that model to somewhere else, I felt like there were 3 places I needed to put that. It wasn't quite as easy as I wanted. But this has moved on. This is a fairly old version now, so I will be looking at Agent Zero again in the future. I know they've made some pretty big changes recently, so this was one to watch again, but for now it's on the bench. There are some other things I'm going to be looking at first. So what do I use now? What do I use every day? Well, one of the things that I do a lot of is solve problems that are largely deterministic. They do not need AI agent processing except for one very, say, small judgment part where a large language model would be great, or a vision model would be ideal to ascertain what that text means, how to classify it, or what's in that image. For these kinds of things, I use Python. It's just a programming language. I use that language and then call an API. Typically, I'll call a large language model that is remote and is not on our local infrastructure, because these are quite programmatic, deterministic workflows. I feel I want sort of production level large language models underneath, so my local stuff won't really cut it. It's not quite good enough yet. Up till now, I've used either Gemini, Gemini Flash, Opus is unlikely, maybe Sonnet from Claude Anthropic. These workflows tend to work programmatically the same every time. They are Python code. They're scripts that I run locally. This is nearly all of my on-demand stuff is a script that I run and that I've developed in a local IDE, and happens to have a bit of it that calls and uses AI for some judgment or other. Python has dependency hell, like many such interpreted languages do. To solve that, I use UV. People use Anaconda or whatever, but I use UV. So UV and Python, really daily drivers for programmatic code that reliably goes from the input that I'm expecting to the output that I want, with AI stuff to help with that processing along the way. The other one that I use is Node. And that's not a surprise. If I use Google Cloud Functions, which runs on Node, then I might use Node locally. In fact, Node is generally on the Raspberry Pi because that's how N8N runs, but that's kind of it, really. These are the 2 things that I use. Locally, on demand, it's usually Python. For so long, large language models have been good at Python, so it's a fairly reliable place to get stuff done with AI helping write the code in the first place. I also use N8N quite a lot. I mean, I mentioned that already. That's running on that Raspberry Pi. It runs automations that sit in the background, and there's a lot of really useful stuff that goes on there. You can see I have quite a lot of these workflows that are constantly running in the background. I said before that I kind of assumed the Raspberry Pi would be the experiment place, the non-production stuff. But this has yet to break. It works really, really well, so I trust it to run quite a lot of automations. Now, within this platform, you can call AIs, third-party AIs, with simple nodes. For example, there are ones for analyzing images, generating audio, doing stuff with OpenAI. There's likewise for many others. There are also like dedicated AI agents, where you will add sort of chat model to it, some memory tools, some tools it can use. I don't actually tend to use this very much. This is only because I tend to have, again, quite well-defined workflows, and I use an API call for a very specific part to do a little bit of AI processing in one bit. I don't tend to use this chat interface with N8N, but it's there. It's pretty good. Lots of people enjoy using this as a way to serve up their own sort of agents. I just don't tend to use that yet. I think there are other directions that we're going to go for this. One of the really useful things that I use here is the ability to take existing workflows that you've got and expose them as an MCP server just for that. So if you're unfamiliar with MCP servers, nearly every agent platform or native ChatGPT, OpenAI, or whatever, will accept MCP definitions of tools, that is your tools on your system, that the agent can call and run. So for example, I have one here where it may send me a signal message or add something to my shopping list. Fairly basic stuff, but it's quite useful to be able to define that in a very deterministic way in N8N and then use one of these server triggers to encapsulate that. I can add the tools there and expose this, and then in my Claude or Cursor or whatever, I can then add this MCP server, and then it can call it. And in truth, what it's calling is one of my deterministic N8N workflows. MCP servers are kind of going out of fashion because they require you to add a huge amount of information in the context window to your agents. If your agent is only doing a handful of things, because it's only for a handful of things, that's probably no problem and is quite convenient. But if it's going to be in charge of interacting with all your stuff, then the progressive disclosure mechanism of skills is just better for it. They have a definition that is only 100 tokens long, handful of words to define what it is and what it uses, and then the agent will know if it needs to learn how to do that by looking up that skill definition in more depth. And that may not be an MCP thing at all. It might just be a regular webhook. And of course, N8N already does that as well. So it's maybe that I don't need these MCP servers anymore, but they're here, they're useful. I can plug them in all over the place. And so I can expose things that are deterministic and built into my own home lab server sort of setup here. And I can expose them to my AI assistants, no matter what the platform is. Now, this is the first program where I use it constantly every day, and I pay for it. This is Cursor. I think it's only something like £16 a month. It's actually in dollars, but that's what comes out of the bank account. I used to use VS Code, and I used to use the local tab completion that came out. I could use a large language model to do my autocomplete for me, which is great. Or I can then use a chat panel and do all that. I never paid for GitHub Copilot when it came out. I was already using very, very light models locally. And then I gave Cursor a go. I think it might have even been a trial, and I just stuck with it because I like this idea of having an integrated development environment. I can see all my files. They are all there. I can see all my chat window, and I can see whatever I've got open, and I can pull up a terminal and do my work. And having this all in one place is sort of how I like to work. So I do an awful lot here. This is for coding. But realistically, it works as editing any sort of file that any large language model can handle. And because I'm paying for it, it is using flagship models. As I said, I do a lot of Python editing. Of course, I do that in here. And I can edit other files. I think the other day I had a PDF that I needed to do some editing in. I opened it in Cursor and just had it do it here, and then went off and did something and came back, and I told the agent to do it, and they'd gone and done it. This is what I do an awful lot of work on files or work making code with. Of course, the alternative to that, which isn't something I've gone into yet, is of course Claude Code, maybe even Open Code, maybe even Pi. That's one of my favorites. I'm going to be playing with this shortly, but for now, I don't want to just type into the terminal and have it do all the work. I do kind of like to keep an eye on everything through an integrated development environment, so I'm still using Cursor for now. One interesting use case I've found when it comes to the tension between writing code in an agentic IDE like Cursor, when it's very efficient at doing that, and having easily manageable workflows on a platform like N8N, is when you can actually get them to talk. This plugin for Cursor is pretty great. It's called N8N Atom 3, I think, and it allows you to connect a user in your N8N instance to your local Cursor environment, and then you can have your agent make the code, and it will put it live into this editor, so you can see what your workflow looks like. It means you can quickly prototype some pretty complicated workflows with some agentic help. Now, of course, if you're paying for N8N Cloud, you can do that by conversation with N8N's own AI stuff, I think, but I don't. I'm self-hosting and I do have Cursor, so this is quite useful. As a caveat, I do make sure that it has its own user that has like 0 privileges other than making workflows. And then I go in as an administrator later and shift them in to the admin user. I don't know entirely where all my data goes. I think it has to go through some third-party servers here. So I'm happy to make prototypes. Then as soon as they're going to come live and have real credentials put into them, they go into the proper M8N instance and user. The other platform that I use absolutely daily, if not every few minutes, is Perplexity. It's the one that I pay for. It's where most of my chats happen. I started subscribing to this back when conversation with ChatGPT or with Claude could go off the rails because it could claim something that was no longer true because it didn't regularly go and check if there had been changes. It basically didn't cite live, up-to-date, web-based sources by default, and I wanted that, so I pretty much used Perplexity since then. I'm sure those platforms now are much better at using the web tool more frequently. I don't know. I use Perplexity, have done. I can still choose those as models. And down here, I can pick many flagship models like GPT 5.4, Gemini 3.1 Pro, Sonnet 4.6. It does have access to quite capable models. And I can also upload files, process images, or ask it to generate images, which I do quite often. It also has a deep research mode where it will go way deeper with many more sources and tend to produce like a report output. I find that really useful if I suspect a surface level search isn't going to come up with quite enough, or I want to send it with a long prompt into many different directions. I can give it that as a request and then go off and do something else, come back to a report with citations of up-to-date sources. I don't yet use Computer. I know it's pushing that an awful lot of the moment, running code in an agentic way on a remote platform, but it still seems to be advertising it to produce the same kinds of outputs that I might already be making in Cursor. And so I haven't found a use for that just yet. Perplexity does have a whole array of connectors that you can add it to, which would allow it to look in Google Drive, add stuff to OneDrive, all this sort of thing. I'm far more interested in something that has come out only very recently in March. This custom connector now includes basically any MCP server URL, which is fantastic. It wasn't available up until very recently. I think you could get it on the Mac desktop app version, but that was about it. Now I can get it to call my own MCPs, which is realistically as interesting right now as being able to get it to add stuff to my own shopping list in Todoist, but still it's possible. And anything else that I build in N8N that I then expose as an MCP, I can now get working from Perplexity, making it much more of a competitive front end to my conversations and starting to offer nearly everything that I would have potentially paid for Claude or ChatGPT to do. An honorable mention when it comes to coding and research, I don't always ask Perplexity if I know my conversation is about the internal workings of a GitHub repository. I tend to go to DeepWiki. This is a really simple tool to find and use. Find your repo, and then you can go to the GitHub part and replace it with DeepWiki, and you will end up at a Devin produced summary of that. And you can ask it questions about the internal workings of the repository. I do this quite a lot when I'm not sure whether I trust maybe a repository that's shared on Reddit, is not massively well known. I might ask here rather than pulling through the code myself. And with particularly complicated frameworks, it's been really useful to ask in-depth questions about how it works internally right here in DeepWiki. Now, here's a platform that I rely on whenever I want to use private local AI. It's a simple Docker image that runs on this computer because I'm at the computer when I want to use it. It is open WebUI. It does interact with third-party APIs if I connect it to it, and I have done. but also it interacts with the local Llama instance, which I'm using at the moment to serve some models. For example, I have GPT OSS 20B. I have got Qwen 3.5. I've recently installed Qwen 3.6. I can ask some pretty in-depth questions that maybe include sensitive client data, and I don't want them to go across the internet. But I can also do agentic stuff. I can give them tools. I've got a couple of versions here where I've given them tools and features of the platform so that it can do a web search, use code locally, all that kind of stuff. They've also given it MCP server access so it can add stuff to my Todoist shopping list or send me signal messages. This platform recently added skills, which is excellent as it's becoming a de facto way of generating repeatable patterns and tools that many different agent platforms can then follow. So no matter what framework we end up relying on in the future, if we give it all the same skills, it should have all the same capabilities as whatever we were coming from. It's constantly being updated, and I know it's moving fast and it's really keeping up. For a long time, this has been very lightly behind the major chat interfaces and in many other ways quite far ahead. So I really love having this available. I particularly love that you can enter call mode, which even works from my mobile. So if it's not local, where do I do my AI inference? Well, I've mentioned Llama, that's the local one. What do I do when it's on the web? It's OpenRouter pretty much exclusively. This is because I can call Gemini here, I can call Anthropic here, I can call GPT here, although I don't. I'll explain why. In fact, I can call nearly every AI model that has been put out there, and I can call it from many, many underlying platform providers. OpenRouter routes it to those. I particularly like the privacy settings that I can set on with OpenRouter. I can enforce zero data retention, and it will use only endpoints that do not retain any data. That's why I don't use GPT. It doesn't have any endpoints that don't retain data, whereas I can still use Anthropic, I can still use Gemini, and I can still use loads. Now, the data retention on those other platforms by default is not necessarily terribly bad. They hold data for 30 days, 90 days, whatever. They offer these zero data retention routes through OpenRouter so that it's not retained at all. And realistically, that is likely the only way I could trust to use client information with third-party AI models if I could trust that there was zero data retention. And even then, I can still exclude providers where perhaps I don't necessarily believe that they're regulated close enough for me to trust that they really are zero data retention. If I don't like a particular provider for whatever reason, I can bring it out of this. And I can be confident that whatever model I call via OpenRouter, it will find an inference provider, an underlying compute provider that complies with my privacy requirements. So this is pretty much the only way I call large language models by API. When it comes to local models, I use Llama. There's an awful lot that I don't have to do because I use it. It auto sets up a whole bunch of stuff. I'm aware that means that I'm not always squeezing the best out of the platform. Occasionally, where there are changes between versions, something breaks. But I love that 99 times out of 100, I can just download the model and go with Llama. And that's pretty good stuff for a user. If I wanted to squeeze the maximum performance, I would probably use llama.cpp, but there are other inference providers available like SGLang, VLLM, NM Studio. There are plenty. These can run on local hardware serving models if you've got powerful enough hardware. Llama tends to figure out how to get the best out of your hardware, even if it's not that great, which is why that's pretty much where I stay, at least for now, until I've rested on something where I want to squeeze the most out of it. But AI is also used for understanding speech and producing speech, producing images, producing videos. So here's what I use for that kind of thing. I rely on this platform, Speeches, which serves Faster Whisper. That's the underlying technology to do speech recognition. And that's what I use in Open WebUI so that when I talk, it can turn that into text and understand it. Another way I do that is with Voxtral. That's the API access method available from Mistral. If I'm doing it in NA10, let's say sending a voice note over Signal, that goes to Voxtral to turn into a transcription. As that's always on, and my PC might not be, which is where I do speeches and faster whisper. For speech generation, I used to use Speeches, which used Kokoro. I think it also had Piper, but I used Kokoro, which is a pretty good text-to-speech platform. But at least in the Speeches implementation, it really struggled with long text, and it used to go on a little bit. So I switched to Supertonic 2, which is fairly light on computing requirements, runs locally, and produces pretty good sounding speech. It's made it much more natural to get spoken responses out of Open WebUI. I had to wrap it myself. It didn't come with an API that Open WebUI could talk to, but Cursor sorted them out pretty simply for me. Another good way of dealing with speech input is simply dictation. It's probably built into the operating system already. It used to be terrible on Windows 10, which is why I had to invest so much time and effort trying to figure out how to get faster whisper to work. But in Windows 11, it's pretty good. I think for me, it's the Windows key and H. And then I get this little dialogue, and when I speak, it will turn it into text in where I am in the operating system. That can be quite useful. A useful bit of hardware that I got for privacy when talking to the computer, maybe there are lots of other people in the house, or maybe I'm out and about, is this MuTalk device, the MuTalk 2. It's simply... yeah, it looks kind of silly, but it's really effective at cutting out your speech, and the microphone mutes when you put it down on the desk. For images, I tend to use OpenAI API, especially if I'm going to do that from a script. Image Generator 2 has come out. It's supposed to be really good, but I'm still using 1.5. It's fine for my purposes. You can do it in Perplexity. I have done that before as well. What I find quite useful is doing it in conversation. In Perplexity, I can get video generated. You just simply tell it to do it and it comes out. Hopefully none of that's particularly new to any of you, because that's the norm for chat interfaces. And I said at the start, that's really level 0 for using AI in business. Remembering there's somewhere you can go, type, and get results and stuff produced pretty quickly. Be that content, analysis of files, editing of stuff. Use those chat platforms, or you can use Open WebUI and local LLMs and get quite a lot done through conversation alone. So that's the current lineup of AI tools that we use pretty much daily. I hope you've found something useful in this whistle-stop tour of AI platforms that we use. Maybe something you hadn't heard of before, maybe something to Google. At least now we have one self-contained video where everything we currently use has been touched and mentioned, and I can at least refer to it in the future. But that's it for now. See you in the next one. I think we've pretty much covered it all. You've been going so long that my lights run out. If you like what we've been doing here, hit the like button. And if you want to keep up to date with our progress and see actual walkthroughs with implementation details, hit subscribe. If you want to get involved, go check out our school.com community link in the video description. We're right at the beginning with this, so it's completely free right now, and you get a chance to help shape this early community of fellow business owners and operators actively implementing AI right now. There'll be tons more interactions and content there than we could ever squeeze into a YouTube video description or comment section, so go take a look, and don't be afraid to join and introduce yourself. All we ask is that you be on the path of actually implementing AI in your business. But if you just want to keep watching here, this is the full current implementing AI playlist, and this is our most recent video. Enjoy.